Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I am Simona Soverini from the University of Bologna, Italy, and it is my great pleasure to discuss with you about when BCR-ABL mutation testing is recommended in chronic myeloid leukemia patients. However, before talking about when, I think it is important to first remind you why BCR-ABL mutation testing should be performed in specific instances and why it is important for routine patient management. Knowledge of mutation status is important for optimal management, and for those of you who are not yet convinced about that, let me remind you that patients harboring mutations have a biologically advanced disease, and this has nicely been demonstrated some years ago in this study by Jerry Radich's group. They performed gene expression profiling of CML patients at various stages of the disease and clearly showed that chronic phase patients positive for mutations and blast crisis patients have superimposable gene expression profiles, which means that biologically speaking, it's the same disease. You know that indeed the transition from chronic to advanced phase in CML does not occur through discrete steps, but is rather a continuum. While in this continuum, patients harboring mutations are closer to advanced phase patients. So morphologically speaking, they are still in chronic phase, and hopefully most of them will remain in chronic phase. But biologically speaking, they have a different and more insidious disease. They have a greater genetic instability that may also foster the acquisition of additional lesions in other genes, reduce oncogene addiction, and increase the likelihood of resistance. Because of their greater genetic instability, they have been found to have a greater likelihood of acquiring additional mutations once they are switched from first line to second line, or from second line to third line, and so on. So they are a critical category of patients who need to be monitored more closely and more carefully. Last but not least, detection of some specific mutations impact on subsequent line TKI selection because thanks to the integration of in vitro IC50 sensitivity data and clinical experience, we now know quite well which mutations are resistant to which TKI. And here in this table, you can see the multitude of mutations that have been reported in association with imatinib resistance. Now, second generation TKIs have been more rationally developed in order to have greater potency and or greater specificity. Yet some imatinib resistant mutations, as you can see here, remain a problem for dasatinib, nilotinib, or bosutinib, and neither of the three is active, as you know, against the T315I mutation. Ponatinib represents the third generation. With ponatinib, rational chemical design has led to a compound that can bind BCR-ABL irrespective of any mutation. Thus, ponatinib is active against the T315I too. However, it has been recently reported that a pre-existing T315I mutation may further mutate and become T315M or L. Now, in contrast to isoleucine of the T315I, methionine or leucine of the T315M or L interfere with ponatinib binding. And this is the reason why they have been recently reported in patients who have relapsed on ponatinib treatment. So assessing mutation status is essential in a patient who shows an unsatisfactory response to TKI treatment since it may offer precious information about the biological aggressiveness of the disease, and in some cases about the subsequent line TKI that is more likely to be effective. Eliminating the mutant clone is important to improve response, but also to prevent the emergence of compact mutations. Because if the original mutant clone is not rapidly and fully eradicated, it may acquire a second hit that is a mutation resistant to the second TKI, giving rise to a highly challenging compound mutant. I remind you that compound mutants are when two mutations are acquired by the same BCR-ABL molecule, and they sit on the same clone, as opposed to polyclonality when two mutations are acquired by two distinct clones. Now, why should the compound mutations be prevented? Well, because starting in 2014, a series of publications have reported that at least on the basis of IC50 values estimated in vitro in BAF3 cells, a series of compound mutations could be expected to be poorly sensitive not only to first and second generation TKIs, but in some cases also to ponatinib. And if this was true, we would be in trouble, since ponatinib is generally considered the last bullet we have in our gun in case of multi-mutated patients. To address this issue, we have recently reviewed the results of routine BCR-ABL kinase domain mutation screening performed by targeted next generation sequencing between 2015 and 2019 in an attempt to compile a catalog of the most frequent compound mutations detectable in large series of Philadelphia chromosome positive leukemia patients, and to correlate in vitro predictions about TKIs in sensitivity with in vivo observation. First of all, we found that compound mutations, as you can see here on the left-hand side, are rare in chronic phase CML patients, but can be detected in more than 30% of advanced phase CML, or Ph-positive ALL patients with TKI resistance. Second, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, we found that compound mutations are more frequently the result of a failure of two or more lines of TKI therapy, and that, as you can see here in the list of the most frequent compound mutations we found in our series of patients, they most frequently include at least one second-generation TKI resistant mutation, most frequently the T315I. Third, as you can see here in the red table, we checked which TKI the patients were resistant to at the time of compound mutation detection. And so we could verify that indeed some compound mutations in which the T315I is paired, for example, with the E255K or V, or with the F359V, had indeed been detected in patients who had not responded or relapsed on ponatinib. Now that I have hopefully convinced you that mutation testing is important, let's see when we should perform mutation testing. It is important to bear in mind that mutation testing is not like MRD monitoring and should be performed only if and when necessary. According to the ELN recommendations, mutation testing should be performed whenever patient response is not adequate. And the ELN recommendations also help us to evaluate when response is adequate or not. You all know very well this table that on the basis of residual BCR-ABL transcript levels at key time points during therapy tells us whether a response can be defined as optimal, failure, or warning. I remind you that failure means you have to change therapy, and warning means that TKI treatment should be carefully considered for continuation or change, depending on patient characteristics, comorbidities, and tolerance. Now, when mutation testing is recommended, at diagnosis before the start of TKI treatment, mutation testing is useless. Mutations have never been reported in chronic phase patients at diagnosis, and even in a recent study that took advantage of a highly sensitive and accurate single molecule sequencing approach, no mutations could be detected in chronic phase CML patients. Whether mutations can be detected in the few cases who are diagnosed in accelerated phase or blastic phase remains a matter of debate, and the very little number of such cases does not help us. There are very few data available for this rare category, but I do believe that in the absence of any selective pressure exerted by TKIs, it is highly unlikely that mutant clones can be present and detectable by the current technologies. Mutation testing should be performed in case of failure because it may inform treatment decision making, and the mutation testing should also be performed in case of warning, in my opinion. Why? Because detection of a mutation would support a change of treatment. And this might not be considered cost effective, but we need to consider that the cost of testing is nothing if compared to the cost of second generation TKIs and of ponatinib, and helps to rationalize their use. And what about TFR failure? More than 30 clinical trials of discontinuation have been performed so far, for a total of thousands of patients, and no mutation, if not in a single or in very, very few cases, have been described in patients who have failed to enter treatment-free remission, losing their major molecular response. So performing mutation testing in these patients is not deemed to be necessary, but if your patient resumes TKI treatment and does not regain a major molecular response within 3 to 6 months, this is what usually occurs, then the presence of a mutation should be probably ruled out. I would like to underline that there is a threshold of BCR-ABL transcript level below which mutation testing becomes technically impossible. And this level is 0.1%, that is major molecular response. So in patients with major molecular response or better, mutation testing is not only clinically relevant, but is also technically very challenging. Hence, if a patient has an increase in BCR-ABL transcript levels not leading to MMR loss, for example, if the patient goes from MR 4.5 to MR4, for example, and we are wondering whether there is an emerging mutant clone in this patient, the answers to this question will not be provided by mutation testing, not even using very highly sensitive approaches. Now let's discuss how BCR-ABL mutation testing should be performed. Sanger sequencing has traditionally been used and considered the gold standard for routine BCR-ABL kinase domain mutation testing. But over the past 5 years, several groups, including ours, have set up NGS-based assays and have demonstrated that they are superior to Sanger sequencing in terms of greater sensitivity and straightforward identification of compact mutations. A series of studies published over the past years have indeed demonstrated that NGS may provide a more accurate picture of mutation status. So patients apparently wild type by Sanger sequencing may harbor low-level TKI resistant mutations detectable by NGS only, and even patients positive for mutations by Sanger sequencing may be found to carry additional low-level mutations by NGS. So with finger sequencing, whose sensitivity is around 20%, which means 20 mutant BCR-ABL transcripts in 100 total transcripts, we can only detect the tip of the iceberg. So NGS analysis that can go down to the sensitivity, let's say, ranging between 1 to 3%, in several cases can be much more informative. And this is true, as I mentioned, not only with failures that we usually may have additional low-level mutations, but also in cases of warning in which you can nicely find emerging low-level mutations when using NGS. So is NGS ready for routine? The use of NGS has indeed been endorsed by the latest 2020 ELN recommendations. However, routine NGS is not easy to implement for BCR-ABL kinase domain mutation testing and still has a series of limitations. First, the turnaround time of NGS is generally longer than that of Sanger. Second, these instruments have typically quite a remarkable throughput. And third, they are not yet widely available due to the high capital investment that is necessary. So all this means that samples need to be centralized in medium to large scale laboratories serving as reference laboratories, which is not always logistically feasible. And in the absence of commercial kits, validation and standardization of laboratory developed tests, not only internally, but also within national and international networks will be critical, a little bit like it happens for real-time qPCR. So for all these reasons, NGS is technically demanding, requires standardization, and is not yet widely available for except for big labs. So in the future, there might be further technical evolutions. So error-corrected sequencing, for example, will increase our confidence in calling low-level mutations. And more importantly, alternative and easier strategies are likely to be implemented, like assays specific for some key mutations, like the T315I, or second-generation TKI-resistant mutations to be run on digital PCR instruments, or maybe even in the future, some mutation-specific cascade gene expert cartridges. So these strategies would for sure make mutation testing easier, cheaper and quicker, and above all, accessible to many more physicians worldwide. So acknowledging that at the present time, NGS may still be a privilege for a few, my advice is to perform mutation testing in the scenarios we have discussed before, preferentially with NGS wherever available or accessible, or with Sanger sequencing in all the other cases, bearing them in mind the importance of mutation testing for optimal patient management. And that was my last slide. I thank you for your attention, and I am available at this email address to answer your questions. Thank you.